Hi folks, it's November 2020 and today's video is all about the upcoming COVID-19 vaccination. Is it going to be mandatory? Is it safe? We have a lot of questions, so let's get started. We're in the main section of COVID-19. You could use the search bar, but we're just going to scroll down to COVID-19 vaccine. Click on that, and here we go. Before we dig into the specific COVID vaccine, let's look at vaccines from a broader perspective by going up here to vaccines, and you'll see specific vaccines underneath, but I'm going to scroll over here to vaccine safety. And under vaccine safety, you'll find the Vaccine Safety Conference. And I'm going to play some snippets from some of the videos that you'll find in this section.
Barbara Loe Fisher is co-founder and president of the National Vaccine Information Center.
We have come together to evaluate vaccine safety science because there is a crisis upon us. And this crisis is fueled by a loss of public trust in what many doctors tell people about the safety of vaccines and the risks of infectious diseases. In the second decade of the 21st century, almost everyone knows someone who was healthy, got vaccinated, and was never healthy again. That anecdotal evidence is in part fueling a loss of public confidence in the quality and quantity of the science used to justify mandatory vaccination policies. While reports of vaccine-related chronic health problems and deaths have increased, and doctors inside and outside of government have continued to dismiss vaccine-related injuries and deaths as coincidental.
Delegates from around the world included senior scientists, physicians, editors of scientific journals, experts in vaccine regulation, social science and health policy, consumer child health advocates, legal experts, and members of the media.
Woman in a grocery store with her husband examining a cereal box, and she says apparently some of the additives cause a nerve disorder, but some of the other additives cure it. Like this cereal, most drugs have risks as well as benefits, and our obligation as scientists is to equitably adjudicate the degree to which each occur, and as physicians to represent that reasonably to our patients. Expectations are that, or best patient care requires that, the data procured by scientific studies should conform to the truth. The published evidence should in turn conform to the data that's been procured, and the practice should conform to the published evidence. Practice as mediated in turn by education, CME, which stands for Continuing Medical Education and Guidelines. And the question that we'll be addressing in this talk is, are these expectations met, primarily focusing on this and this point, with this addressed more in the talk tomorrow. So the title is, or a version of the title is Treatment Risks and Benefits Stacking the Deck. And the thesis is that there's an imbalance in information dissemination that relatively favors drug benefits over drug harms. And I've found that this has been the case for virtually every drug class or drug that I've studied on my own or for RAND, including statins, the anthrax vaccine, that should have been aspirin, and pyridostigmine bromide. And I came to this issue because initially I was confused as to why this occurred. Why was it the case that the guidelines said this, whereas the published evidence very clearly said something different? And this imbalance in information dissemination occurs at virtually every level. Which studies are done, which of the ones that are done are published, and what in those studies is said. Which of those studies are propagated to reviews and editorials, what happens at the level of the medical journal that determines whether an article is accepted for publication, which of the published evidence is disseminated via media, by medical education, by advertisements to physicians, what is the influence of regulators, including such regulatory agencies as the FDA, how does this operate at the level of advocacy groups like patient groups, and other groups like the Institute of Medicine that generates reports and academ, and finally, how does this propagate to practice in patients, including generation of guidelines according to which many of us physicians receive performance pay. So as we'll see, there are disparities in how studies are designed, how studies are published, and how the findings are disseminated, and in turn how these translate to guidelines. So we'll start with the issue of published data versus data that are procured. And as we'll see in the slides to follow, it is commonly the case that unfavorable results are not submitted. There's even recent evidence that data are falsified in a fashion to make them look more favorable, that bad results are portrayed as though they are good, and that good results, studies that look favorable, may be published not once but multiple times in a way that obscures the fact that it's the same.
I'm going to talk about discursive and rhetorical devices and constructs that are currently undermining fundamental patients' rights in a vast range, in a vast area. And you can see their applicability to vaccines, and I'll be highlighting that in a couple of places. But I'm very much looking at this from a macro level about patients' rights. And the theme that I want to highlight at the outset is that we are seeing in language and the concept of rights, a co-opting and contorting of the terminology and the language that we're using. As a character says in a very good Tom Stoppard play called Rock and Roll, we have to begin again and use the ordinary meaning of words. Giving new meaning to words is how systems lie to themselves.
It should be obvious, I think, that which is effective and safe at the community level should also be safe and effective at the individual level. It's not always that way. The data that are used to evaluate these questions at the group level and using epidemiologic methods are not the same kinds of methods, and it's not the same kind of data that are used to evaluate things at the individual level. So I'm going to flip back and forth using this schema as I run through things. Vaccine safety, for those of you who don't know, it's defined here in the U.S. As the relative freedom from harmful effect to persons affected directly or indirectly by a product when prudently administered, taking into considerations the character of the product in relation to the condition of the recipient at the time. In the U.S., we have a legal standard. Vaccines are defined as unavoidably unsafe products. There's a lot of wiggle room in there, which makes it very difficult to engage in conversations about, what level of reaction is acceptable versus not acceptable. How safe do things have to be in order to be declared safe for both individuals, specific individuals, and also the community as a whole.
Did you know the terms vaccination and immunization don't mean the same thing? We can find out what the difference is by clicking on this link. The terms immunization and vaccination are not the same. Vaccinations typically cause hypersensitization reactions, such as allergies, asthma, with contaminants such as mycoplasma or herpes-type viruses, such as Epstein-Barr. Cancers can be triggered. Immunizations, on the other hand, are caused by natural exposures to foreign proteins that challenge our immune system. Confusion exists because the healthcare industry wants people to believe that vaccinations prompt natural immunity, which they do not. A quote by Dr. Horowitz. If you click on the tab for this video by Dr. Obukanyich, you'll get an hour and a half of an excellent explanation about the difference between natural immunity and vaccination. She's an immunologist. I'm going to play just a bit of it for you. She starts out by talking about measles, the measles vaccination, how after vaccination we still have outbreaks.
So we would think, if everyone or most of the children are vaccinated here, then what are these outbreaks, right? Are they occurring only in those who were left unvaccinated for some reason? Or what is going on? But actually, no. If you look at the papers, the medical literature, you will see that measles outbreaks involve not only unvaccinated but also vaccinated children. And so I will just read the titles. Measles outbreak in a vaccinated school population. Major measles epidemic in the region of Quebec despite a 99% vaccine coverage. Outbreak of measles in a highly vaccinated secondary school population. And the last one, pretty recent, the largest measles epidemic in North America in a decade. So all of this is published in the journals of public health or epidemiology. And the interesting thing is that my field, the field of immunology, the basic field, the ones that sort of is responsible for all these theories of immunity, we don't really deal with the real world. We do research in labs. We are sort of an ivory tower profession. And we don't even read these publications because this is too far away from our field. We only read what's specific to our research, and usually it's immunizations and how antibodies are generated and all the details of the immune responses. And I went through my whole PhD training, and I believe that vaccines give you immunity, and that if you got vaccines, there is absolutely no way, virtually no way, that you would get a disease. And I'm pretty sure that most of my colleagues in my narrow field believe the same way, and we had conversations about that. And even someone at some point mentioned to me and said that they had a vaccine and they got measles, and I sort of brushed it aside, and the person is confused. It was either she didn't have the vaccine or it wasn't measles, one of the two. But what happened is that a few years ago, I had to apply for American citizenship, and part of the procedure is to submit your vaccination records, right? And this was the first time that I looked at my own vaccination records carefully, and I discovered that I had 2 measles vaccines in my childhood. Well, I didn't know about it because I was too young to remember. But what I remember really well is that when I was 11, I had measles. And so that was a little bit harder to discount. And I told recently someone else, and they said, "Oh, you are confused about that. You didn't have measles. Like, how do you know? Like, did you check your, was really the virus there or not?" So it just, the doctor's diagnosis, right? But I lived in Ukraine, and there, there was tons of measles around, and doctors knew when they saw measles. But anyway, so the reason I kind of had to look for these papers is to actually to confirm to myself whether I'm confused about my measles, or is this a general phenomenon and it's happening, and it's documented in the literature, and indeed it is documented in the literature. But immunologists don't know about it.
So with this and other background information you can get in the Herbal Database, let's turn our attention to the COVID vaccine. One of the many benefits of using the Herbal Database for your research is that related topics are directly linked. For example, here we are under the COVID-19 vaccine. You might not think to look up luciferase, for example, but there it is. Or pharmacovigilance, what is that? And of course, linked up here is about the mandatory vaccination policy. Above, we've got the general heading of vaccines, COVID-19 prevention, and drugs for COVID-19. The SARS coronavirus vaccine is for SARS, not COVID, but it's useful to see what happened with that vaccine. Now I'm going to open up the info panel all the way and just give you an idea of some of the links here. So this is the World Health Committee. It's a recent video that was done, a briefing on vaccination against COVID and other diseases. And then in October, experts had a briefing on the COVID-19 vaccine during the Union World Conference. And here is a PDF specifically about the safety surveillance manual from, I think this is the CDC's COVID safety surveillance manual. So you'd be well equipped to judge the vaccine for yourself after you go through this. So we're back in the notes section. There's a lot here, and I'm going to invite you to subscribe to the database to see all of it. I just want to talk about some of the main points. Right off the bat, we have a video from October asking if you would take a vaccine that could make you sick. And the question here is, given the speed with which this vaccine, any of them, are being rolled out, are we sure that they are going to be safe? And then we have another important point right here, that this and other vaccines don't prevent infection. Their aim is to prevent symptoms. by training the immune system to recognize a pathogen and defend against it. And that's a point that was made by Dr. Fauci. Now, we've got in the United States Operation Warp Speed. That is the program to bring out a vaccine as quickly as possible. In this area, this link takes you to some concerns about Operation Warp Speed. Here are some of the main points. One of the issues is this pharmacovigilance surveillance system where they're going to be able to tell who has the vaccine, who doesn't, and they'll be tracking the disease using this system. And we have to see what happens to people's physiology, because they admit that every single one of these vaccine candidates has never been brought to market or licensed by the government. So that's part of what is done with pharmacovigilance. That's part of how they determine whether it's effective and safe. And here's a video on the trials. Are they rigged? There are a lot of fears that the vaccine may be imperfect. Let's skip down to this section on the mRNA vaccines, also called DNA vaccines sometimes, because that's the new kid on the block. That's what they're really pushing for, and it's very different from traditional vaccines, which work to train the immune system to recognize a bacteria or virus by injecting it or parts of it into the body. In this case, what they're doing is described this way. What mRNA vaccines boil down to is this. First, your cell needs to create a protein. In this case, that protein's an antibody that attaches itself to the virus and prevents it from infection of other cells or tags it for destruction by the immune system. To make that protein, your DNA in the nucleus of your cell sends code to another part of your cell called a ribosome. That code gives the ribosomes all of the instructions they need to gather amino acids and bind them together to make proteins. Now, under normal circumstances, your immune system would have to see the virus, absorb it, have its genetic material analyzed by your cells, and then your cells would create the antibodies. This process can take some time, and it requires you to be infected with the virus or vaccinated with a vaccine that contains some or all of the virus. When you're given an mRNA vaccine, the mRNA goes into your immune cells' ribosomes and tells them to create the virus antigen, the identifying protein. That antigen would then be recognized by your immune system, and the cells of the immune system would create the antibodies you need to fight off the virus. This skips the need for you to be infected and the immune cells to find the virus, process it, and present the viral antigens to your immune system. These vaccines have the advantage that scientists are not growing the virus in the lab, which has been a hindrance sometimes to create enough to give a vaccine. The vaccine itself isn't infectious, meaning the chance of it giving you the disease is zero. And the vaccine has a low risk of triggering an unwanted immune reaction, since it's nothing more than a blueprint for ribosomes to make proteins, something they do all day. Well, it sounds pretty good, doesn't it? It sounds a lot better than the traditional vaccines. However, there are a number of well-known doctors raising the alarm about this as genetic engineering, and we don't know what kind of consequences there could be from inserting genetic material directly into the nucleus of the immune cells of our body. There are several videos here in the database where they explain their concerns. You may have seen this one by Dr. Andrew Kaufman, where he explains it is genetic engineering. I hear that it went viral. A fact-checking organization came out and said this was a false claim, that a COVID-19 vaccine will genetically modify humans. This article confounds a traditional vaccine, which injects a piece of the virus, with the new DNA-RNA vaccines in development. It states that genetic modification would involve the deliberate insertion of foreign DNA into the nucleus of a human cell, and vaccines don't do that. So much for the fact checkers. Folks, we really have to check these fact checkers. Often they don't know what they're talking about. I'm going to give you a little snippet of Dr. Andrew Kaufman's explanation of what's going on with this.
As you said on the article here, it says that it would basically not involve the insertion of foreign DNA into the nucleus, and that's the main argument of why they feel what I claimed was incorrect. So if we go to this article here from Medscape, and so they have this article here written by doctors from the University of Michigan about DNA vaccines, and they basically explain how the DNA vaccines work. And so there's a nice little picture here, and you can see that it shows this is the piece of DNA in a circular form they call a plasmid. It's based on a structure of DNA that comes from bacterial cells originally, and it would have the gene that they're trying to put into us that they say is from a coronavirus. And you can see that it goes across the cell membrane here, through the cytoplasm and into the nucleus. And right here in the text below, it says the plasmid DNA vaccine carries the genetic code for a piece of pathogen or tumor antigen. The plasmid vector is taken up to the cells and transcribed in the nucleus. So that's exactly what it does, what the Reuters article misquotes, that this DNA from the vaccine has to go in the nucleus because that's where it's made into RNA. There's no machinery to make it to RNA in the cell membrane, in the cytoplasm. So it does go into the nucleus. Thus, it is a genetically modification of our own bodies.
Whichever of the vaccines for COVID-19 are rolled out, they're likely to contain quantum dots in order to record whether or not you have been vaccinated and to store other information, especially health information. If you haven't heard about quantum dots, this section will give you videos and information about them. In a second, I'm going to show you a short video of the quantum dot in action. It was discovered in the 1980s. They have a number of different applications. Here we're talking about this specialized dye being delivered along with a vaccine. Now let's take a look at the vaccines that are in development. And there has been a problem creating vaccines for other related coronaviruses. The dead viruses in those vaccines, due to the unique shape, causes the body to overreact with a cytokine storm, which can kill you. And coronavirus is the primary cause of the common cold, and there's been no vaccine for the common cold. The likelihood of an effective traditional vaccine for this is small. And here you can look up the SARS coronavirus vaccine. Also note, vaccine testing doesn't end at phase 3. For that, we turn towards pharmacovigilance surveillance, where health effects are tracked over time, while the speed at which these vaccines are progressing is unrivaled in humanity's vaccinology history. Experts warn we still have a long way to go to achieve a safe, effective vaccine. Even after a vaccine's been rolled out, it's critical to monitor the safety and efficacy. There's never certainty. This ongoing surveillance is sometimes referred to as phase 4. Now here's an online tool that shows the state of 218 vaccines in development. There's a GMO tomato being developed as an edible COVID vaccine. New guidelines for ethical approach to infecting trial volunteers. But I'm going to just now go down to the vaccines themselves, the front runners. Novavax, that's a small company. They are considered to be ahead of the others in terms of coming up with a structural analysis of the spike protein that is very advanced, and that may be a good traditional vaccine. Then we've got CoronaVac. It's out of China. It's in phase 2. Now, I'm going to be updating this section as things develop. We've got one from Pfizer and BioNTech. It's in phase 3 trials. The developers say they should know by the end of October if it works or not. The Chinese are also working with BioNTech on an mRNA vaccine. Here's another one of COVID. It's a gene-based COVID vaccine. That sounds like another DNA vaccine. And the big one looks to be the one by Moderna, mRNA 1273. And the reason I say that is because here, if you click on this link, you'll go to a PDF that shows that the Department of Defense placed an order for 500 million doses of the Moderna vaccine. Let's go down. We've got another one from Johnson & Johnson. They had some problems with their trial and had to cancel it after a single dose. Someone got very ill. And then there's the AstraZeneca, that's out of Oxford. They're fast-tracking theirs, and it's in phase 3. It had some problems, but it's started up again. Somebody had got fractured teeth from using that. And then here's the Russian Sputnik 5 vaccine. India's also a player. They're making something called Covaxin, made in India's Bharat and ICMR. Now, moving on to distribution, and is it going to be mandatory? So there's a section in the database on mandatory vaccination. You'll find it by clicking on this link, and it gets into the ethics and legality of the policies for mandatory vaccination. Here we have a video that says that who gets a coronavirus vaccine may depend on the 2020 census. Lots of questions about whether it'll be mandatory. Right now, the prevailing thinking is that while it won't be mandatory in the sense of a government regulation, it could be in terms of whether or not an employer requires it, or schools could require it, or in order to travel, you may have to show that you've been vaccinated. The New England Journal of Medicine promotes mandatory vaccinations and tells states how to do it. In Colorado, there's a bill requiring for re-education classes for parents who refuse coronavirus vaccine. So this is another area where, of course, I'll be updating as we learn more about what the law is going to be regarding the mandatory vaccination. You might want to look up this article, Will Law Protect Health Freedom Against Mandatory Vaccination? And then we've still got many questions. Well, thanks for spending time with me. I hope this has helped give you some insights into the upcoming COVID-19 vaccinations. And in the next video, while we're still talking about prevention, we're going to be covering nutritional support and treatment for COVID-19. So be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video and share it with all your friends. Thanks again. Bye-bye.